Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves lost both legs above the knee to an IED in Kandahar province on March 7, 2021. 14 months later, after 6 surgeries, 4 infections, and 212 days of rehabilitation at Walter Reed, he was discharged and flew home to Atlanta on a Wednesday afternoon. Nobody was at the airport. No wife, no daughter, no family, no welcome home sign, no handshake. Daniel Reeves wheeled himself through Gate B7 of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in a government-issued wheelchair with his discharge papers in a manila envelope on his lap, and the only person who spoke to him was a janitor named Curtis, who helped him lift his bag into the trunk of a taxi. 2 years later, Daniel Reeves sat on the Family Feud stage in that same wheelchair. And when Steve Harvey learned what had happened at that airport, the most composed host in the history of daytime television put his face in his hands and broke on camera in front of 200 people and 7 cameras and the entire country. It was September 12th, 2024. A Thursday afternoon inside the Atlanta studio where Family Feud had taped thousands of episodes. The Reeves team stood on stage left, not a family by blood, but a family by fire. Daniel sat at the front of the line in his wheelchair. Behind him were 4 men who had served with him in Afghanistan: Staff Sergeant Kevin Banks, Corporal Luis Ramirez, Specialist Andre Thompson, and Private First Class Darnell Okafor. They had registered as a family. They were one. Across from them stood the Benson family from Charlotte, North Carolina. A mother, a father, and 3 grown children who ran a barbecue restaurant together and laughed the way families laugh when everything is intact. Daniel's hands were resting on the wheels of his chair, and he was watching the Benson family with an expression that looked like grief and respect in equal measure. Steve Harvey shook every hand on that stage. When he reached Daniel, he looked down at the wheelchair and then up at Daniel's face, and something flickered across Steve's expression that the cameras barely caught. Daniel Reeves was carrying a secret that would soon change everything. Daniel Reeves had enlisted at 19. He had wanted to be a soldier since he was 6 years old, watching his grandfather, a Korean War veteran, polish his medals at the kitchen table every Veterans Day. Daniel had been good at it. He had risen to Sergeant First Class in 8 years. He had deployed 3 times. He had led a 12-man engineering squad responsible for route clearance in Kandahar province. He had found and neutralized 37 IEDs before the 38th found him. The blast had happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Daniel had been on foot, leading his squad down a road they had cleared the day before. The Taliban had planted the device overnight. The pressure plate had detonated directly under his boots. The blast had taken both legs instantly, one above the knee, one just below. It had shattered his pelvis. It had ruptured his left eardrum. He had been conscious for the entire thing. He had looked down and seen that his legs were gone. He had looked up and seen Kevin Banks running toward him with a tourniquet in each hand. Kevin had saved his life in under 90 seconds. Walter Reed had been 14 months of surgeries, infections, and physical therapy. Daniel had learned to use a wheelchair. He had been fitted for temporary prosthetics that did not fit properly and caused blisters that bled through his liner every day. He had been placed on a wait list for custom prosthetics through the VA. The wait list was 11 months. The VA had classified his case as routine bilateral above-knee amputation. The word routine had been printed in size 10 font on the intake form. Daniel had read the form 14 times. His wife Sarah had come to visit him twice during the 14 months at Walter Reed. She had brought their daughter Emma once. Emma had been 3 then. She had sat on Daniel's hospital bed and touched his face and asked him why he was sleeping in a big white room. Daniel had told her it was a special hotel for people who were getting better. Sarah had cried in the hallway that day. She had told Daniel's mother that she could not do this. She had filed for divorce 4 months later. She had taken Emma to her parents' house in Virginia. Daniel had told his squad that Sarah was just busy. He had told Kevin and Luis and Andre and Darnell that Sarah was handling things at home. He had told them that Emma was growing up fast. He had lied because telling the truth meant admitting that the man who had survived 37 IEDs could not survive his own homecoming. On discharge day, Daniel had called Sarah. He had said, "I'm coming home Wednesday. Can you bring Emma to the airport?" Sarah had said, "Danny, I can't. I'm sorry, I just can't." Daniel had said, "Okay." He had called his mother. No answer. He had called his brother. His brother had texted back, "Sorry man, working. Glad you're out. Call you later." His brother had not called later. Daniel Reeves had wheeled himself through Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport on a Wednesday afternoon in May 2023. Gate B7, Terminal B. The corridor had been full of people rushing to their own lives. Not one of them had known that the man in the wheelchair had lost his legs defending their country 14 months earlier. A janitor named Curtis Williams had seen Daniel struggling with his bag. Curtis had walked over and said, "Let me help you with that, brother." Curtis had carried Daniel's bag to the taxi stand. Curtis had shaken his hand and said, "Welcome home." Curtis was the only human being on Earth who said those words to Daniel Reeves. The apartment Daniel moved into was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. He carried himself up those stairs on his arms every single day for 5 months before his disability payments kicked in and he could afford a ground-floor unit. He ate alone. He slept alone. He went to therapy at the VA twice a month. He called Emma every Sunday at 7 p.m., 1 call per week, as Sarah allowed. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. The part that made Steve cry came from what Emma had said on a phone call 2 weeks before the Family Feud taping. Emma was 5 now. She barely remembered Daniel's face. On that Sunday call, Daniel had asked Emma what she had done that day. Emma had said she went to the park. Daniel had asked if she had fun. Emma had said yes. Then Emma had gone very quiet and asked, "Daddy, are you real? Or are you just the voice?" Daniel had not been able to speak. He had held the phone against his ear in his empty apartment and pressed his hand over his mouth so his daughter would not hear him crying. He had said, "Baby, I'm real. I promise I'm real." Emma had said okay and gone back to playing. Kevin Banks had found Daniel on the floor of his apartment that night. Kevin lived 2 blocks away and checked on Daniel every few days. Kevin had found him sitting in the dark with his phone still in his hand. Kevin had sat down on the floor next to him and said nothing for 20 minutes. Then Kevin had said, "We're going on Family Feud, all 5 of us. You need to see that people are still alive. And your daughter needs to see that her father is more than a voice." Daniel had said no. Kevin had said, "I didn't ask." The game was close. The Reeves team won the first round on a question about things soldiers miss most. Daniel had buzzed in first and said, "A bed." The Bensons won the second round. The third round went to a tiebreaker. The question was, name something you'd travel 1,000 miles to do. Kevin Banks buzzed in and said, "See someone you love." Number 1 answer. The game went to fast money. Daniel and Kevin went up together. The questions came fast. Daniel answered 3 of the 5. His voice was clear. His hands were steady. They scored 187 points. Kevin stepped into the booth. He answered 2 more. The total came to 214. The board lit up. The jackpot was $40,000. The Reeves team had won. Daniel did not cheer. He put his hands on his wheels and looked at the floor and took a breath so deep it shook his entire chest. Kevin came running out of the booth and grabbed Daniel's chair and spun it around once. The audience erupted. Steve walked over to congratulate the team. And then Steve said the thing that cracked everything open. "You boys came a long way for this. Who's waiting for you at home?" Kevin looked at Luis. Luis looked at Andre. Andre looked at Darnell. All four of them looked at Daniel. Nobody answered. The studio fell completely silent. Steve's smile faded. "Nobody?" Steve said. "Nobody's waiting at home?" And then Kevin Banks said something no one in that studio was prepared for. Kevin Banks looked at Steve Harvey and said, "Nobody was at the airport when he came home, Mr. Harvey. He lost both legs for this country, and nobody was there." Steve Harvey stood still. His jaw tightened. His eyes filled. He looked at Daniel Reeves sitting in his wheelchair, and he put his cue cards on the floor and pressed both hands to his face and cried. The studio fell completely silent. 2 camera operators were crying. The boom mic operator lowered her boom. The Benson family across the stage had their hands over their mouths. Steve Harvey dropped to one knee in front of Daniel's wheelchair. "You came home alone?" Steve said. "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "To an empty airport?" "Yes, sir." Steve looked at the camera. He looked back at Daniel. His voice cracked. He said 5 words that ended up on the chyron of every cable news broadcast in America for the next 2 weeks. This country failed this man. The studio fell completely silent. Steve stood up. He did not wipe his face. He turned to the lead producer and said, "Stop everything. We're not done here." The producer said, "Steve, we're in the middle of—" "I don't care," Steve said. "Roll the cameras and don't stop until I tell you." Steve turned back to Daniel. He said, "Sergeant, before I do what I'm about to do, I need you to hear something." Kevin and Luis and Andre and Darnell were standing behind Daniel's chair. 4 soldiers guarding their brother one more time. 35 years ago, Steve said, I was alone. I was broke. I was at the bottom. An old man at a gas station looked at me one morning and said, "Son, God's got a plan bigger than your pain." I held on to those words. I held on to them for 35 years. And I'm going to say them to you right now, because you need to hear them more than I did. God's got a plan bigger than your pain. And today, that plan starts. Steve pulled a phone from his pocket. The producer did not try to stop him. The first call went to the CEO of a private prosthetics company Steve had supported for a decade. Steve put it on speaker. "I have Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves on my stage. Double above knee amputee. He's been on a VA wait list for 11 months for custom prosthetics. Can you get him fitted this week?" The CEO said, "We'll have him in Monday morning." The second call went to a veterans housing organization. Steve arranged for immediate housing, a fully accessible ground-floor apartment with wheelchair modifications, rent-free for 2 years, funded by Steve's foundation. But Steve wasn't done. The third call was the one that broke the studio in half. Steve dialed a number. A woman answered. The voice was nervous. "Sarah?" Steve said. "Yes." "Sarah, this is Steve Harvey. I'm standing on the Family Feud stage with your ex-husband, Daniel. He just won $40,000 for his brothers. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because your daughter asked her father 2 weeks ago if he was real or just a voice. And I need you to bring Emma to see her father. Can you do that?" There was silence on the phone. Then Sarah said, very quietly, "I didn't know it was that bad." I didn't know he was alone." "He's been alone for 2 years," Steve said. "Will you bring Emma?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Yes." Steve hung up. He knelt back down in front of Daniel. Daniel was crying. Kevin was crying. The entire Reeves squad was crying. Steve said, "Your daughter is coming to see you, Sergeant. She's going to know that her daddy is real." The studio erupted. The Benson family walked across the stage without being asked. Robert Benson shook Daniel's hand and said, "Son, our family's prize money is yours too. Every dollar." Gloria Benson knelt beside Daniel's wheelchair and held his hands and prayed out loud. The audience stood. Every crew member in the building stood. Steve looked into the camera one final time. "Everyone watching at home, look at this man. He gave his legs for you. The least you can do is stand up for him." But Steve wasn't done. Steve walked behind Daniel's chair. He placed both hands on the push handles. He said, "Sergeant, you wheeled yourself through that airport alone. You're not wheeling yourself off this stage alone." And Steve Harvey pushed Daniel Reeves's wheelchair off that stage, with 4 soldiers walking beside them. The episode aired 5 days later. It pulled 450 million views in the first 12 days. The most watched Family Feud moment in the history of the franchise. The hashtag #WelcomeHomeDaniel trended in 51 countries. The clip of Steve saying, "This country failed this man," played on every major network. 3 congressmen referenced the episode in floor speeches about veterans' care. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs issued a public statement acknowledging systemic delays in prosthetics delivery. Danny's Welcome Home Foundation, launched the morning after the taping, raised $6,400,000 in the first week. The donations came from 53 countries. A retired Marine in Okinawa gave his entire monthly pension. A group of 5th graders in Memphis held a lemonade stand and raised $347. A billionaire who wished to remain anonymous matched the first $5 million. Steve framed the 5th grader's letter and hung it in his office. Daniel was fitted with custom prosthetics the following Monday. The rehabilitation took 3 months. On a cold morning in January, Daniel Reeves stood on 2 legs for the first time in nearly 3 years. Kevin Banks was standing beside him. Daniel took 1 step, then another. Then he sat back down and cried for 10 minutes. Emma came to visit 3 weeks after the episode aired. Sarah drove her from Virginia to Atlanta. Daniel sat in his wheelchair in the living room of his new apartment. Emma walked through the door. She stood in the entryway and looked at him. She said, "Are you the voice?" Daniel said, "I'm the voice, baby, but I'm real too." Emma walked across the room and climbed into his lap and put her arms around his neck and did not let go for 11 minutes. 6 months later, Daniel was walking on his prosthetics. He was working part-time as a mentor at a veterans transition center. He was seeing Emma every other weekend. The marriage was over, but he and Sarah had learned to be parents again. 1 year later, Danny's Welcome Home Foundation had funded airport welcome home events for 312 returning veterans. Every single one of those veterans had been met at the gate by volunteers holding signs and shaking hands. Not one of them had come home alone. 2 years later, the foundation had expanded to provide accessible housing for over 800 disabled veterans across 29 states. Daniel sat on the board. He gave speeches. He told the story of Gate B7 and the janitor named Curtis Williams, who had been the only person to say, "Welcome home." Daniel tracked Curtis down. Curtis had been working at Hartsfield-Jackson for 22 years. Daniel found him and shook his hand and said, "You were the only person who welcomed me home. I need you to know that mattered." Curtis had cried. Steve flew Curtis to the Foundation's annual gala. Curtis was given an award. The award was called the First Welcome. Steve gave one interview about the moment Kevin Banks told him nobody had been at the airport. Steve said, "I've been on that stage for 15 years. I've heard stories that broke me. But when Kevin said those words, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was living in my car. I felt shame. Not my shame, America's shame. And I decided in that moment that I would never let another soldier come home to an empty gate." On a Thursday afternoon in September, exactly 2 years after the Family Feud taping, Daniel Reeves walked through Gate B7 of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport on 2 prosthetic legs. He was not in a wheelchair. He was not carrying his own bags. He was walking toward a crowd of 200 volunteers holding signs for a soldier none of them had ever met, a 23-year-old private who had lost an arm in Syria and was coming home that day. Daniel stood at the front of the crowd. Emma stood beside him, holding his hand. When the young soldier came through the gate and saw 200 people waiting for him, his knees buckled. Daniel was the first person to catch him. Some soldiers lose their legs defending a country that forgets their name. Some soldiers come home to empty airports and silent hallways and voices on the phone asking if they are real. And some soldiers are found by strangers who refuse to let them arrive alone. Hit the like button and leave the name of a veteran you love in the comments. Because somewhere tonight, a soldier is coming home, and the only thing standing between an empty gate and a welcome is someone who chooses to show up.